The winter dawn over the village was quiet, almost unreal. The snow that had fallen overnight covered the ground with a soft blanket, and only the light squeak of sled runners and the distant bark of dogs broke the silence. John's cabin stood on the very edge of the village, where it merged with the forest, and his windows looked out at the snow-covered pines, as if guarding the border between the human world and the wild. John, a man in his 60s with a face weathered by wind and time, was used to this silence. He knew the forest like the back of his hand. He knew its sounds, its shadows. But that morning, the forest brought him something he didn't expect. He woke up early as always to light the stove. It was still dark outside, with only the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. John was drinking tea watching the fire when he heard a sound. Not a bark, not the crunch of twigs, but something strange, almost human. A scraping, timid step on the porch. He frowned, put down his mug, and grabbed the rifle that hung by the door. Not that he was afraid. Over the years in the forest, he'd seen everything from bears to poachers. But caution was in his blood. Opening the door, John froze. On the snow right by the porch stood a wolf, thin, with a coat covered in ice and scratches on its sides. It didn't growl or bare its teeth. Its eyes, yellow as the setting sun, looked at John with such longing that he instinctively lowered his rifle. The wolf was trembling, not from the cold but from something else. A fear not for itself but for someone else. It took a step forward, then another, and sat down, lowering its head as if surrendering. John stood motionless. He had seen wolves hundreds of times in the forest from a distance in tracks on the snow. But this one was different. It wasn't running away, it wasn't threatening, it was just looking. And its gaze was almost human, full of pain and pleading. John felt something clench in his chest. He remembered his wife, Jane, who had died 10 years ago. She always used to say, "John, every creature has a soul. Look into its eyes, that's where the truth is." And now, looking into the wolf's eyes, he saw that truth. "What is it, Gray?" John asked softly, although he knew there would be no answer. The wolf blinked, its ears twitched, and it took another step, as if inviting him to follow. John frowned. He knew the forest stories about wolves that lure you in, about traps, about cunning. But this wolf wasn't a predator. It was lost. John looked at the snow and noticed the tracks, deep, uneven, with a furrow as if the wolf had been dragging something heavy. And then he understood. This wolf hadn't just come. It was asking for help. John went back inside, his gaze falling on a photo of Jane on the wall. Her smile, as always, was warm, as if she was whispering, "Help him, John." He put on his old jacket, grabbed the first aid kit he kept for himself, and a lantern. He left the rifle by the door. "If you trick me, Gray," he mumbled, "I'll remember it." But deep down he knew this wolf wouldn't lie. He went out onto the porch, and the wolf, seeing him, slowly got up, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The snow crunched under John's boots, and the wolf walked ahead, looking back as if checking that the man was following. Its steps were cautious but determined, and its eyes kept returning to John. The forest was silent, only the wind whispered in the branches, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. John walked, feeling the cold seep into his bones, but something inside wouldn't let him turn back. He remembered how, many years ago, he himself had been injured in the forest, having fallen from a cliff. Jane had found him then and stayed with him all night until the rescuers came. She hadn't abandoned him, and this wolf, it seemed, hadn't abandoned someone either. The tracks led deeper into the forest, to an old trail where people rarely walked. John noticed that the furrow in the snow was getting deeper and the tracks more frequent, as if the wolf had been running back and forth. And then he saw it. In a small hollow under an old pine tree, something metal gleamed. A trap. And in it was a she-wolf, thin with ash-colored fur. She was alive, but her paw, caught in the iron, was bleeding, and her eyes, full of pain, looked at the wolf who had brought John. John stopped. His breath caught. The she-wolf didn't move. Only her sides rose weakly. The wolf sat down next to her, his eyes fixed on her, and whimpered softly. A sound that John would never forget. It wasn't a howl or a growl, but something that tore at his heart. John looked at the wolf, then at the she-wolf, and felt tears sting his eyes. He understood. This wolf had gone to people, trembling with fear, because he couldn't leave her. For her he lived. "Okay, Gray," John whispered, kneeling down by the trap. "Let's try." The wolf watched him without moving, and in its eyes was a glimmer of hope. Thin, fragile, but alive. John knew this was just the beginning. But in that moment under the cold winter sky, he felt that he was doing something right, something that Jane would have approved of. The morning light broke through the pine branches, casting long shadows on the snowdrifts, and the frost nipped at his cheeks, a reminder of the harshness of this place. John, clutching the first aid kit and lantern, followed the wolf, whose coat, covered in ice, looked silvery in the dim light. The wolf kept looking back. Its anxious yellow eyes seemed to say, "Hurry, human." John didn't know where this animal was leading him, but he felt he couldn't stop. The wolf's tracks in the snow were deep, with an uneven furrow, as if it had been dragging something heavy. John, an experienced woodsman, immediately understood. This wasn't just a trail. It was a path of desperation. He remembered how the wolf had stood on his porch, trembling with fear, but not running away. That gaze, almost human, gave John no peace. He knew the laws of the forest. Wolves don't approach people, don't ask for help. But this wolf had broken all the rules, and John, without even realizing it, followed him, as if obeying something greater than reason. The trail wound between the pines, leading deeper into the forest to an old hollow where a human foot rarely stepped. The snow here was pockmarked with tracks. Small, frantic wolf tracks and rough human tracks from heavy boots. John frowned, noticing a glint of metal under an old pine. A trap old and rusty with teeth covered in snow and blood. And in it was a she-wolf. Thin with ash-colored fur, she lay curled up. Her paw was caught in the iron, and her sides rose weakly. She was alive, but her eyes, dull with pain, looked off into the distance, as if her strength was leaving her. The wolf that had brought John sat down beside her, his eyes fixed on her. He whimpered softly, a sound so full of longing that John's eyes teared up. The she-wolf blinked, her gaze shifted to the wolf, and a spark flashed in it. Not fear, not despair, but something warm, as if she knew that he hadn't abandoned her. John knelt down, feeling the cold of the snow seep through his pants. He looked at the wolf, then at the she-wolf, and his heart clenched. He understood. This wolf had gone to people because he was ready to do anything for her. "Quiet, Gray," John whispered, though his voice trembled. "I'll try." He opened the first aid kit, taking out bandages, antiseptic, and scissors. The wolf watched him, not moving, but its ears were alert, and its body was tense. John knew that one wrong move and the animal could lunge. But deep down he felt that it wouldn't. The wolf trusted him not because it wanted to, but because there was no other way. John carefully crawled toward the trap, trying not to look into the she-wolf's eyes. She didn't growl or thrash. She just lay there. Her breathing was weak, almost inaudible. John noticed that the snow around them was covered in human tracks, deep and careless, as if someone had set the traps and left, forgetting about them. He gritted his teeth, feeling anger rise in his chest. "Who would do this to you, poor things?" he muttered, though he knew there would be no answer. The forest kept its secrets, but this one was too cruel. He carefully touched the trap, trying to figure out how to open it. The rusty springs creaked, and the she-wolf flinched. Her eyes widened for a moment with pain. The wolf whimpered louder but didn't move. "Quiet, quiet," John whispered, addressing either the she-wolf or himself. His fingers, callous from work, trembled, but he slowly pressed on the lever. The trap clicked, releasing the paw, and the she-wolf twitched weakly but didn't get up. Her paw was lacerated, blood mixed with the snow, and the bone seemed to be intact but damaged. John took out the antiseptic and a bandage, trying to act quickly. He cleaned the wound, feeling the she-wolf tremble under his hands. She didn't growl or bite. She just looked at the wolf as if drawing strength from his gaze. John bandaged the paw, trying not to tie it too tightly. "You'll make it, girl," he said softly, though he wasn't sure. He knew how difficult it was for wild animals with such wounds, but there was something in her eyes that left him with no doubt. She wanted to live for him. John took out an old blanket that he had brought from the house and carefully wrapped the she-wolf in it. She was light, almost weightless, as if hunger and pain had wasted her away. He picked her up in his arms, feeling her heart beat weakly but steadily. The wolf stood up. His eyes followed John's every move. "Let's go, Gray," John said. And the wolf walked beside him, not falling a single step behind. They moved back toward the village through the snow-covered forest, where the silence now seemed not empty, but full of meaning. The journey was long. The snow crunched under their feet, and the she-wolf lay in John's arms, her breathing barely audible. The wolf walked alongside them, occasionally touching the blanket with his snout, as if checking that she was alive. John looked at him and remembered Jane, his wife, who always believed in goodness. "You would have understood them, Jane," he thought, feeling tears sting his eyes. He wasn't a romantic. He didn't believe in fairy tales. But this wolf, this gaze, this love, they were real. When they reached the village, the sky was already brightening, and the first rays of the sun touched the snow, turning it into sparkles. John stopped at his cabin, looking at the wolf. "I don't know how to save you," he said softly, "but I'll try." The wolf looked at him, blinked, and in his eyes was not a threat or fear, but something John couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, or hope. John carried the she-wolf into the shed, where it was warm from an old stove. He laid her on straw, covered her with the blanket, and placed a bowl of water nearby. The wolf stayed outside, sitting by the door as if guarding. John watched him, feeling his heart beat faster. He knew this was just the beginning. The she-wolf was alive, but her road to recovery would be long. And the wolf he wouldn't leave, wouldn't abandon her. And John, without expecting it, realized that he wouldn't abandon them either. The old stove crackled, casting a soft light on the walls, and the smell of straw mixed with the smoke. The she-wolf lay on a bed of old blankets. Her ash-colored fur shone in the dim light, and her bandaged paw looked as fragile as a twig. She was weak but alive, and her eyes, now a little brighter, followed John's every move. The wolf who had brought him to her sat by the shed door, not coming inside. His yellow eyes watched the she-wolf, and there was such devotion in them that John felt a lump in his throat. A day had passed since John had carried the she-wolf out of the forest. He hadn't slept that night, sitting by the stove and listening to her breathing. He knew how fragile her life was. The wound was deep, hunger and cold had weakened her, and a wolf's nature couldn't tolerate captivity. John wasn't a romantic. Over the years in the forest, he had seen animals die from wounds, how nature took its course. But this she-wolf was different. She fought as if she knew she wasn't alone. And the wolf, her silent guardian, gave John no reason to doubt it. Every morning, John came to the shed with a bowl of water and a piece of meat he got from his neighbor, Old Man Brooks. He would place the food in front of the she-wolf but wouldn't get close or look into her eyes. "Eat, girl," he would say softly, stepping back toward the door. The she-wolf at first only sniffed the meat. Her ears trembled, as if she was expecting a trick. But on the second day, she began to eat slowly and cautiously, her gaze never leaving the wolf sitting at the entrance. John watched them and remembered Jane, his wife, who always fed stray cats on the porch. "They trust people, John," she would say, "but they understand love." And these two, the wolf and the she-wolf, understood love better than many people. The wolf didn't approach the food John left for him. He just sat watching the she-wolf, and his thin sides rose and fell, as if he had forgotten his own hunger. John tried to get closer, but the wolf tensed. His fur bristled, and he growled softly, not menacingly, but as a warning. "Okay, Gray," John would say, stepping back. "I won't get closer." He understood. The wolf didn't trust him. He only trusted her. And everything he did was for her. John changed the she-wolf's bandage every day. He cleaned the wound, feeling her flinch but not growl. Her eyes followed him, and in them was not only pain but something else. Cautious curiosity. John spoke to her as if she were a person. "You're a strong girl. You'll pull through." He remembered how many years ago, he himself had lain in the hospital after falling in the forest. Then Jane had sat by his side, holding his hand, and her voice had given him strength. Now he was the one giving strength, and this feeling was new, almost forgotten. But salvation wasn't just in bandages and food. John knew that the she-wolf wouldn't survive in the shed forever. She needed the forest, freedom, her life with the wolf. He looked at them and thought about how they had found each other in this harsh world. He saw how the wolf lay down by the shed door every evening, not going inside but not straying far. His fur was covered in snow, and his eyes never left the she-wolf. John felt his heart ache at the injustice. Someone had set this trap, someone had left her to die, but the wolf hadn't left and John couldn't either. One day, on the third day, the she-wolf tried to get up. Her paw trembled, but she stubbornly rose, leaning on her healthy legs. John froze, afraid to startle the moment. The wolf, sitting by the door, perked up his ears and his tail twitched. The she-wolf took a step, then another, and looked at him. Their eyes met, and John felt tears sting his eyes. It wasn't just a look. It was a love so strong it was more powerful than pain, more powerful than fear. The she-wolf lay down, tired but alive. And the wolf whimpered softly as if saying, "You can do it." John began to build a temporary pen in the yard so the she-wolf could get some fresh air. He wasn't a master craftsman, but his hands, used to an axe and a shovel, worked quickly. He made a low fence out of old boards, covered the ground with straw, and moved her bedding there. When he carried the she-wolf out, she blinked, inhaling the cold air, and her eyes sparkled. The wolf entered the pen but kept his distance, watching her. John looked at them and thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. Two animals who had found each other even in their hardship. But there were difficult moments too. Sometimes the she-wolf would refuse to eat. Her breathing would become heavy, and John would fear the wound was inflamed. He would sit by the pen looking at the stars and whisper, "Jane, help them. You would have known how." The wolf, as if sensing his anxiety, would come closer but never cross the invisible line. John would look at him and say, "You're a good boy, Gray, you didn't leave her." And the wolf would blink as if he understood. Every evening when John turned off the lights in the cabin, he would see the wolf's shadow by the shed. He didn't leave even when the snow fell in flakes, even when the wind howled in the forest. He waited until the she-wolf was strong enough. And John knew he had to wait too. He couldn't just save her body. He had to save their love, their life. It was more than he expected, but less than they deserved. One morning, when the sun broke through the clouds, the she-wolf got up and went to the wolf. She nudged her head against his neck, and he licked her, whimpering softly. John watched them, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He knew they would survive, not because he was strong, but because their love was stronger than anything. But there were still many steps ahead to freedom, to the forest, to their real life. In the pen, on a bed of straw and old blankets, lay the she-wolf. Her ash-colored fur glistened, and her bandaged paw no longer seemed so fragile. She lifted her head, breathing in the cold air, and her eyes, now clear, followed the shadow of the wolf who sat at the edge of the pen, not coming closer. John stood on the porch, holding a bowl of meat, and looked at them, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. These two, connected by something greater than life, were teaching him to believe in miracles all over again. A month had passed since John had carried the she-wolf out of the forest. Her wound was healing slowly but surely. She had started to get up, leaning on her healthy paws, and her steps, at first timid, were becoming more confident. Every day, John changed the bandages, brought water and food, but never offered her any extra affection. He knew she was wild, and her trust wasn't something that could be taken by force. The she-wolf ate from his hands, cautiously taking the meat, and her eyes, once full of pain, now looked at him with a quiet understanding. She didn't fear him, but she didn't seek closeness either. Her heart belonged to the wolf, and John respected that. The wolf was different. He never approached the bowl that John left for him, though his thin sides spoke of hunger. He sat by the pen day after day, night after night, watching the she-wolf. His fur, covered in snow, looked silvery, and his eyes, yellow as the sunset, never left her. John tried to talk to him. "Eat, Gray, you need strength too." But the wolf only blinked. His ears twitched, and he would turn away as if saying, "Not me, her." John looked at him and remembered Jane, his wife, who had sacrificed her last to make sure he was fed. This wolf was the same, living for her, forgetting himself. John didn't rush them. He would come to the pen in the morning and evening, silently, checking the bandages, adding more straw to keep it warmer. He talked to the she-wolf as if she were a person. "You're a good girl, you're walking now." She would listen, tilting her head, and sometimes she would lick his hand when he changed the bandage. It wasn't affection but recognition, subtle and almost imperceptible. The wolf watched these moments and his body would relax, as if he understood. The human wasn't an enemy, but he never came closer. His place was beside her, but at a distance, like a guard who never sleeps. One evening, when the snow was falling particularly heavily, John noticed that the she-wolf had gotten up and walked to the edge of the pen. She nudged her head against the fence, looking at the wolf who was sitting outside. Their noses almost touched through the boards, and the she-wolf whimpered softly, not from pain but from something else. The wolf answered her. His voice was soft, almost tender. John stood by the shed, holding his breath. He felt tears sting his eyes. This was their love. A love that didn't need words. A love that was stronger than any trap. John knew he couldn't keep them forever. The she-wolf was strong, her paw was almost healed, and the forest was calling them back. He wasn't sentimental, but the thought of them leaving left a void in his chest. He remembered how the wolf had come to him, trembling with fear, how he had led him to her. This wolf had entrusted him with what was most precious, and John couldn't let him down. He started to think about how to let them go, but every time he looked at the she-wolf, he would postpone the moment. "Just a little longer, girl," he would whisper, stroking her head. One morning, John noticed that the pen gate was ajar. He had forgotten to latch the bolt, and his heart sank. He ran out into the yard, expecting to see an empty bed, but the she-wolf was there. She was lying down, looking at the wolf who stood by the open gate. He hadn't come in, hadn't called her. He was just waiting. His eyes were calm, but full of faith. The she-wolf looked at John, then at the wolf, and slowly got up. She took a step toward the exit, then stopped as if asking, "May I?" John felt a lump in his throat. "Go, kids," he said softly, and his voice trembled. The she-wolf walked out of the pen, and her paw was slightly limping, but it held her weight. The wolf nudged his head against her neck, and they stood there, touching each other, as if making sure that everything was behind them. Then they turned and left for the forest. Their tracks disappeared in the fresh snow. John watched them go, feeling tears stream down his cheeks. He didn't try to stop them. He knew that love isn't about holding on, but about letting go. But the story didn't end there. Every night, when John turned off the lights in the cabin, He saw a shadow by the shed. The wolf would return not for food, not for warmth, but simply to be nearby. He would sit at the edge of the yard, looking at the cabin, and wait until the light went out. Then he would leave. His steps were as silent as the snow. John watched him from the window and whispered, "You're a good boy, Gray." He didn't know why the wolf came, but he felt it was their connection. Thin as the winter air, but strong as the roots of the pines. The she-wolf, he was sure, was strong now. Her paw was healed, and the forest had taken her back as its own. John remembered how she had gotten up in the pen, how she had nudged the wolf's head, how they had left together without looking back. He hadn't held them. Love, he knew, doesn't live in a cage. But their nightly visits were a gift, a sign that they hadn't forgotten. John would go to bed, looking at the photo of Jane, his wife, and feel her smile warm his heart. "You would have been proud, Jane," he whispered, looking at the ceiling, and he knew their story wasn't over yet. Spring came to the village slowly, melting the snowdrifts and filling the forest with the sound of dripping water. The pines on the edge of the woods where John's cabin looked out at the endless green, rustled in the warm wind, and the sun, breaking through the branches, painted golden spots on the grass. John was working by the shed, as always, fixing an old bench. His hands, callous with time, moved confidently but unhurriedly. The silence of the forest was his companion, but now it seemed not empty but full of life. And in this life, there was room for the miracle that had begun that winter when the wolf had come to him, trembling with fear. 3 months had passed since the she-wolf and the wolf had left for the forest, leaving their tracks in the fresh snow. John didn't look for them or call out to them. He knew their place was where there were no fences and no traps. But every night, turning off the lights in the cabin, he would see a shadow by the shed. The wolf would return, sit at the edge of the yard and look at the cabin, as if checking that everything was okay. His eyes, yellow as the sunset, shone in the dark. And John, standing by the window, would whisper, "You're a good boy, Gray." He didn't know why the wolf came, but he felt it was their connection. Thin as the spring air, but strong as the roots of the pines. The she-wolf, he was sure, was strong now. Her paw was healed, and the forest had welcomed her back as its own. John remembered how she had gotten up in the pen, how she had nudged the wolf's head, how they had left together without looking back. He hadn't held them. Love, he knew, doesn't live in a cage. But their nightly visits were a gift, a sign that they hadn't forgotten. John would go to bed, looking at the photo of Jane, his wife, and feel her smile warm his heart. "You would have loved them, Jane," he would whisper, and his heart was full of quiet joy. One morning when John was chopping wood by the shed, he felt a gaze. He looked up and froze. On the edge of the woods in the shadow of the pines stood the wolf. His fur, now thick and shiny, shimmered in the sun, and his eyes looked at John with the same calmness as they had in the winter. But he wasn't alone. Next to him stood the she-wolf. Her ash-colored fur looked almost silver, and her paw, once wounded, held her weight confidently. And behind them, in the grass, 3 small bundles were tumbling about. Pups, clumsy with fluffy tails, were playing, nipping at each other. John lowered the axe. His breath caught. He looked at them, and tears, which he so rarely allowed himself, streamed down his cheeks. The wolves didn't come closer, didn't growl, didn't run away. They just stood there looking at him, and in their eyes there was no fear or threat. Only memory. The memory of that winter, of the trap, of the man who hadn't passed by. The pups, not understanding the solemnity of the moment, nudged their mother, and she licked them. Her eyes met John's for a moment. There was gratitude in them. Not human, but the kind that makes you tear up. John didn't move. He knew their world was the forest. Their life was freedom. He didn't want to break this moment, didn't want to startle them. He just watched, feeling his heart fill with something greater than just joy. It was love. Not the kind that holds on, but the kind that lets go. The wolf turned to the she-wolf, nudged his head against her neck, and they slowly went into the forest. The pups jumped after them, disappearing into the shadows. John watched them until their silhouettes dissolved into the green. That night the wolf didn't come. John stood by the window, looking at the edge of the woods, but the shadow by the shed didn't appear. He smiled, feeling a slight sadness but also relief. "You're busy now, Gray," he said softly, looking at the stars. He knew the wolf wouldn't return. He had a family. His life was full, but this meeting, this look at the edge of the woods, was their farewell, not a sad one, but one as warm as the spring sun. John returned to his life, to the forest, to the village, to his quiet evenings by the stove. But now he wasn't alone. In his heart lived the wolf and the she-wolf, their pups, their love, which had turned out to be stronger than fear. He looked at the photo of Jane and said, "We did it, Jane. We helped." And her smile, as always, answered him with warmth. Sometimes, working in the forest, John would notice tracks, large and confident, next to small, clumsy ones. He didn't look for them or call out to them. He knew they were there. In their world where there were no traps, where love protected them better than any fence. And that was their miracle. Not loud or bright, but quiet, like the spring forest.